The Supreme Court will soon weigh in on reproductive rights again, as the justices agreed this week to hear a case about access to mifepristone for medication abortions, which make up more than half of abortions in this country. For many Americans, these Supreme Court decisions have immediate real-life implications.
And that is playing out this week in Texas, where the state Supreme Court overturned a ruling that would have allowed Dallas resident Kate Cox to terminate her non-viable pregnancy. Cox had to leave the state to get that abortion, but the ruling has broad repercussions, and it's put medical providers on the front lines of interpreting legal language while caring for their patients. We're joined now by one such medical provider. That is Dr. Amna Dermish. She's an OBGYN based in Austin, Texas. Dr. Dermish, welcome. It's so nice to have someone with my same name on the show, that we differ slightly in pronunciation. I want to ask you about this exception in the Texas law, though. There's a near total abortion ban in the state. The exception is in the case of a risk to the life of the mother. In the Kate Cox case, she said it was a risk. The court disagreed, and they said in the ruling the exception is predicated on a doctor acting within the zone of reasonable medical judgment, which is what doctors do every day. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what the exception encompasses?
You know, I don't. And I think that really gets to the heart of the matter, is that it's really, we've been set up as healthcare providers to be put into a situation where every medical decision that we make is being second guessed by the legislature and the judiciary. And so physicians are placed in a situation where they are unsure whether what they consider to be their sound, reasonable judgment would be acceptable to our attorney general or to judges in the state of Texas.
You know, we spoke with Kate Cox before that court ruling. Here is just a clip of what she had to say about learning her pregnancy was non-viable.
She'll either die in my belly, or I'll carry her to term and have to deliver her stillborn. Or if she arrives into this world, you know, her life will be measured in minutes or hours or days and plagued with medical devices. She would need to be placed directly onto hospice. So imagine receiving that news and pairing that with the risks and complications of continuing the pregnancy and the childbirth.
Dr. Dermish, knowing the uncertainty you just expressed around interpreting the law, how do you talk to your patients about this kind of thing, knowing many of them will face the same thing that Kate Cox did?
Yeah, well, you know, given that there is essentially a complete ban on abortion in Texas, these conversations are really hard to have, and they're not happening in the way that they should and did even 2 years ago. You know, listening to Kate is heartbreaking because nobody should ever be in that situation. You know, we're in a situation where doctors are having to say how sick is too sick. You know, how close to death does somebody need to be, and who is allowed to make that determination? You know, patients aren't allowed to choose their own risk. You know, is it a 20% risk of death that is good enough to have an abortion in Texas, or does it need to be 70%? You know, how much blood is too much blood for somebody to lose before we can say that this is an acceptable abortion in the state of Texas? And it's an untenable situation. People are forced into these terrible choices that they're not even allowed to make. And as a physician, it's heartbreaking to be there. You know, I have the training and the capacity to provide care to these people. I live here in the state of Texas, and I am prevented from providing essential medical care to patients based on my judgment and the patient's desires by my state.
There's the mission to serve your patients. There's also the legal risk you and your colleagues face in having these discussions. What's the conversation been like among other OBGYNs in Texas?
I mean, I think there's a culture of fear that exists now. People aren't sure what is safe to say to their patients. They're unsure what kind of care they can offer their patients. And they are afraid that if they offer the standard of care, that they will be punished, that they will lose their license, they will lose their livelihood, their family will suffer. And again, you know, and then on the other side, you have this patient who suffers even more from this. And, you know, you go into medicine to help people, and to be held back from that is really devastating as a provider. And I think what we've seen in Kate Cox's case is that the state is determined to prevent us from practicing safe medicine. We see that with the letters that the Attorney General sent to the hospitals and to the physician, threatening them if they were to proceed with providing the standard of care. And I think it's just going to continue to harm people in ways that we can't even imagine at this point.
Well, doctor, as you know, Texas is not alone in its abortion restrictions there. There's some 15 other states that have near total bans. The landscape shifts quickly as well. The Arizona Supreme Court just heard arguments about an abortion ban. Wyoming judge is now weighing whether or not to uphold a medication abortion ban. Do you consult and compare notes with other doctors in other states?
I mean, I'm fortunate to belong to an amazing community of providers across the country. And in some ways it feels like a race to the bottom. And, when we talk about this, the focus is always on the care that our patients need and what we can still do to help them in the face of all these restrictions. Our patients are terrified. My colleagues are telling me that patients are leaving their phones behind when they travel across state lines to get abortion care because they are afraid that they will be tracked and they will be punished for seeking health care. That's the environment that we live in.
That is Dr. Amna Dermish, OBGYN based in Austin, Texas, joining us tonight. Doctor, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.